Okay, so thank you everybody for joining our May webinar. I know we've got a couple of new faces who are joining us for the first time for a Spark webinar. So welcome. Thank you all for participating. We do these once a month. They're free to clients, hopefully topics that everybody finds useful. If you ever have a topic that you would like covered, please feel free to email me. I'm always looking for sample topics or ideas of things we can cover. And then I also, if there are issues that come up that are kind of more pressing, I'll typically send out either an individual client alert or we'll do a specific webinar. I think we're probably going to do one at some point on the new non-compete rule issues because we're getting a lot of questions about that, despite the fact that, as most of you are probably aware, a bunch of lawsuits were filed within the first 18 hours of the FTC rule coming out, and we're expecting the briefing schedule for the court in Texas on the first lawsuit has them probably making a decision on a preliminary injunction sometime before the end of June. We're thinking it's probably pretty likely that the Texas court's going to issue a preliminary injunction, which means that we're probably a couple of years out from that rule actually being enforced. But we'll talk about it likely on a webinar. So be on the lookout for that information. But today we are talking about intergenerational issues. So,
better quote.
What's that?
Okay, not worth it. Yeah.
Okay, so.
Okay, you've already wasted my time going over this. Oh.
Okay.
All right. Let's see around. All
right. So, multi-generational issues. A topic that I have had lots of inquiries about from a number of different clients, because I think it's something we are all obviously facing in a lot of different ways. And so lots of topics, lots of issues that we can talk about that really apply across industry, across organizations of all different sizes, and something we all have in common. So agenda, we're going to kind of understand the lay of the land, what generations are in the workplace currently, what are some of the sort of generalizations about each of the various generations that are currently in the workforce and those that are about to come into the workforce in a few years, both positive and negative. And then we're going to talk about some benefits to multi-generational workforces, as well as various challenges, and then really looking at ways that we can, as employers, can improve our multi-generational employee culture at all of the different kind of pieces of the employee life cycle. And then we'll also, I'll leave you with some sample employee engagement exercises that you can use if you want to build that positive multi-generational culture within your individual organizations. So when we talk about kind of understanding the lay of the land and considering our audience, anytime, obviously, that you approach someone, right, particularly if it's either going to be because you want something from them, you've got a request, or you're hoping to reach some sort of consensus, it's helpful if we know or we have an idea of who we're talking to, right? What are the experiences that have shaped them? What is their background? What is it that they're trying to potentially get out of that same situation? If we can understand and better kind of internalize those things, that increases our odds of being able to connect with that person and to be able to build some rapport, which hopefully will kind of get everybody down the road to a position that is beneficial to both people. And so one of the ways that we have to do that is considering who our audience is. Right now, there are currently 5 different generations in the workforce for the first time ever. Okay. And so we've got our traditionalists as of today who would typically fall between the ages of 76 and 99. We've got our baby boomers, our Gen Xers. We've got our millennials who are, again, between the ages today of 26 and 40. Our Gen Zers who are is normally defined as 25 and younger, but I've added the bullet that they're going to be 25 and younger, but now we've got the Gen Alphas coming, right? And so Gen Alpha are typically defined as those who are born between 2010 and 2024. And so I don't know if any of you are like me, but I've got a little bit of a range at home in these generations, and I've got two of my own Gen Alphas. So I'm used to hearing things like Riz and Sigma and Skibbity, and I have no idea what any of those things mean. And so, that I think is kind of the lay of the land, right? I think that's the best way to kind of set the stage for what we're talking about. Because in the next 4 to 5 years, those Gen Alphas are going to be in the workplace with all of the rest of these generations. And so that's going to be an even bigger change and an even bigger shift. And so I think it's helpful for us to kind of start by understanding what are sort of some of the stereotypical traits of each of the generations, but also recognizing that we need to be cautious when we're dealing with those stereotypes. So there can be certainly generational differences that are generalized, but there's also going to be areas of overlap. And it's those areas of overlap where we can potentially find the most common ground, right? So when we talk about generational acceptance, just as we should never be stereotyping based on race or ethnicity or gender or sexual orientation or any of those other areas, we also shouldn't be stereotyping solely based on age and generation. And so part of how we can avoid those stereotypes is to acknowledge and explore the different overlaps that exist between the generations and understanding also where they're coming from. So for example, one of the most common assumptions that I hear people say all the time is, kind of the baby boomer generation, certainly the traditionalists, want to be in the office 5 days a week, right? They want to be working in person, and the younger generations want to work remotely. But I think one of the things that we've found in some of the more recent, especially post-COVID surveys, is everybody really wants workplace flexibility, right? That's a universal desire across the generations. So the ability to choose how, when, and where we work. Now, may most baby boomers want to work in the office more often than they want to work remotely? Maybe. But there's still a need and a desire across all of the generations for that workplace flexibility. So we're going to start by kind of looking at some common perceptions of generational differences. And then I'd really like to have this be as interactive as possible in terms of, I'd love for you guys to give some feedback about whether you think these things that we're going to kind of go through are accurate or not accurate based on your current workplaces. And so you can certainly free to unmute yourself at that point if you've got a comment, or you can throw it in the chat and we can look at it. But I'm interested to see kind of where people fall when it comes to these things. So when we talk about appreciating generational differences, the first thing we look at is how is loyalty a driver, and differences between the generations as they utilize that loyalty driver. So traditionalists, often people will say, tend to be loyal to the organization as a whole, right? They appreciate long-term commitment, tenures. Again, these are folks who, as a generation, experienced the Great Depression, people who went to work for one employer, stayed there their entire career because it provided stability, because it provided security that maybe, from their own lived experiences was really important to them because of some of the challenges and societal obstacles that they had as a generation. Baby boomers tend to be loyal to the team. So they see their career, their own achievements, their own goals as translating directly to their self-worth. Um, Gen Xers, these are our first kind of latchkey kids. Often both parents in their homes may have been working. They took care of themselves. They developed a sense of self-sufficiency. We're kind of, and I fall into the Gen X category. I was never a big fan of group projects. And I think, one of the reasons is Gen Xers tend to be loyal to their particular manager, right? Somebody that they're working with directly, often exceed expectations and deliver results, but they perceive their career as only being a part of who they are, not everything that defines them. Millennials, they tend to be loyal to colleagues, their peers, the people that they're in the trenches with, so to speak. They expect equitable treatment, and they see their careers as an opportunity to add value and contribute. And I think, a lot of that comes from the fact that they, as a generation, kind of have grown up with a budding social media presence. But they still had some ability to develop personal relationships, and they have a very clear perception of what they think is fair. And so they're not necessarily driven by money. They are more driven by their ability to contribute. I speaking from my own experience and kind of the particularly in kind of the firm where I spent the bulk of my career, I can tell you that this is one of the generations that I think employers, particularly traditional employers with kind of traditional models, are having the most difficulty trying to figure out how to lead, how to incentivize, because kind of the typical way of, well, just throw some more money at it and we'll see better results, better performance, et cetera, doesn't necessarily translate as well when you're dealing with millennials. And then when you're dealing with Gen Zs, they tend to be loyal to the experience, right? And I think, again, they're a generation who grew up really with social media like TikTok and Instagram and all of those outlets that provide a very curated experience. And so they tend to be invested in their careers as a way to grow personally. Their focus is on their own internal needs. And that's often why, people think that they are, as a generation, changing jobs so often, because they're continuing to look for what fits them and who they are and what are the companies and the organizations and the goals that are going to most align for them. And so I think, understanding what drives them from a loyalty perspective and a retention perspective is important. Next issue is looking at organizational structure in response to authority and how the generations differ, again, stereotypically, in how they respond to those things. So traditionalists tend to have respect for authority and for kind of a hierarchical system. They value seniority in job titles. Again, I don't think that is probably a surprise to most people because there's typically security in those kind of well-defined systems. And again, as traditionalists, based on their own lived experience, are often looking for jobs that are going to provide that long-standing security. Baby boomers tend to challenge authority a little bit. They often will desire more kind of flat organizations that are kind of democratic in nature, less of the them and the us, less sort of caste system organizations. They want to say, they want, kind of everybody to have a vote in what happens. Gen Xers, as a generation, tend to be kind of unimpressed by authority, although, as we looked at the prior slide, are often loyal to a particular manager or somebody who's invested in them. And they expect that their competence and their skills are going to be respected. That's what's going to be used to determine whether or not they progress within an organization. They're going to push back against sort of that do it this way because I said so mentality. And they're going to give you more of the tell me what you can do for me. And then I'll kind of decide how I'm going to respond. Millennials as a generation, again, stereotypically tend to respect authority figures who demonstrate competence. They're kind of the show me what you can do for me right now mindset. Again, millennials want feedback. They want raises. They want to progress internally. And they want to know, how are you going to do that from day one? And again, different than the way a lot of organizations are used to operating, because we often don't know on day one, right, what those things are going to look like. We often don't have those kind of defined strictures, and so that can be frustrating for that generation. As Gen Zers, they often will tend to respect the process and follow direction, but they really, really want to be engaged, even more so than millennials, right? They're a generation that doesn't appreciate one-way conversations. They don't want to be told it is what it is. This is why we do it. They want to be not only a part of the discussion, but they also want to be a part of the solution. And again, from an organization that may be more traditional, more of a hierarchical model, more of a top-down approach, that may be difficult for Gen Zers to really appreciate and integrate with. And then we look at how do the generations approach rules within an organization, work rules. How do they approach change, right? Because we know that organizations, in order to be successful, have to continue to change and evolve. But again, if you have a lot of employees who are typically averse to change, that's going to make it more difficult for you as an organization to get buy-in and to get everybody on the same page and consensus. So traditionalists, again, I don't think a big shock, tend to be linear. They tend to follow the rules. They only want change if something is broken, again, because they're often driven by security, stability, and change by its very nature is more unstable and less secure. Baby boomers tend to like a structured organization, but as we talked about before, not hierarchical necessarily, but sort of some framework. But they're going to challenge the rules, and they're going to be cautious about change, right? They're going to often want to see how the change would impact the organization before they decide, kind of how they feel about it. I think, again, stereotypically, Gen Xers tend to be a little bit more flexible. They want to change the rules as needed. They see change as an opportunity, both for the organization, but also for themselves personally. And so, not necessarily as risk averse. Millennials often tend to have more fluid work styles. They expect to create the rules, and they want to make sure that if something is changing, it's changing for the better, that there's going to be some improvement. And they want a say in what those work rules are going to be, what the workflows are going to be. Gen Zers, again, tend to be more agile. They seek balanced rules. And for them, change is just a reality, right? And again, I think with the social media presence, Gen Zers are used to seeing the landscape change so rapidly. The whole concept of cancel culture and what's hot one day and what's out the next, that's just everyday life for them. And so they really don't get, kind of the highs and lows of change as it occurs. So those are kind of the generational differences, sort of from major kind of categories that apply within an individual work place. And so, we'll now kind of talk about how all of these generations work together and how we can bring different perspectives and what are some of the benefits. But before we do that, I want to just stop there for a minute to get some feedback. If anybody, again, wants to unmute or wants to put it in the chat. Any thoughts about sort of these stereotypical things that we've talked about as generational differences, and whether or not you're seeing them apply this same way in your organization, or are you seeing any kind of major variations from the things we've talked about? Nobody? Everybody wants to be quiet. Everyone says, yes, Lorisa, I agree 100%.
I would say so. I think it's pretty spot on to like what I witness. And of course, things can overlap, but yeah.
Thanks, Maddie. And Kelly, yep, definitely see these themes pretty consistently among our team. Good. So we know we're on the right path then when we're talking about these things. So let's talk then about what are some of the benefits of multi-generational workforces. So the first, I think, is, again, none of these are probably shocking, right? But multiple perspectives. So when you've got different generations, they view their job responsibilities very differently. And so sharing those perspectives can bring a broad range of knowledge and lets us support innovation and progress within the organization. And so if people are prioritizing different components of their job or different components of a project, or different components of what the outcome should be differently based on where they fall generationally, having the ability to have those generations work together, where people have different priorities, can help to move a project or a job set or the company as a whole forward. We'll talk about some of the challenges that come with that, but having those different perspectives and priorities, I think, and sharing those and helping to appreciate why people may view things as different priorities is typically going to be useful. Enhanced problem solving. So when we combine different perspectives and the skills that drive each of the generations, we often end up with more creative solutions because our own individual life experiences influence how we may address challenges. And that's really, again, sort of the concept of, more voices at the table, the better, because you're going to get more ideas. And so I don't know how many of you, our family just celebrated, Easter not that long ago. And so, within my own, kind of immediate family, I've got sort of the traditionalists, parents that fall into that category. As I said, I'm a Gen Xer. I've got a Gen Z. I've got two Gen Alphas. And some of my extended family, my brothers and their families were in town. And so we also had some baby boomers, millennials. I mean, we really crossed all of the generations. And it was really interesting to kind of see how everybody interacted. And my mom is, big kind of on when the family's together and we're gonna have like kind of family games. And so one of the games that they played was sort of this a huge Jenga game. And for those of you, I hope are familiar with Jenga, but it's, kind of one of those, a whole bunch of rectangle puzzle pieces. And, they kind of make a big tower and you have to decide, which piece you're going to take out and you got to kind of try to continue to build the tower. It was a perfect, kind of look at how of the generations are different. The kind of the traditionalist, my parents were looking for, kind of what were the most stable pieces that they could pull out that was going to have kind of, the least risk of the thing falling down and the, kind of the most foundation from the bottom up. And then my Gen Alphas were like, oh, pick whichever piece we feel like, and we'll see what happens. And if it falls down, not a big deal. So it's funny just to kind of see, even in those sort of simple experiences, how we can see the different generations find ways to solve issues or to impact challenges. We have benefits, learning and mentoring opportunities. So a lot of sort of reverse and cross-generational mentoring, and we'll talk about mentoring as a specific piece later on in the program, but it allows our more junior employees to educate our more mature workers with their familiarity with current trends and technology, just as our more tenured workers can often advise on career development. So, you know, we've talked about this in one of the recent webinars, but, you know, kind of the use of AI, and that sort of the younger generations are using AI for everything. And older generations often are using it less because they're not as comfortable with it. They don't understand it. They may not trust it as much. And so there can be a lot of kind of reverse cross-generational mentoring there where, you know, the older generations can learn a little bit more about the benefits to using some of these newer technologies. Where, you know, the younger generation, again, because of some of their the fact that everything was, you know, kind of on their phones at a moment's notice, everything is, you know, curated experiences again on social media. They're not as good with things like how to have a face-to-face conversation with somebody. And so, you know, if you as a younger millennial or a Gen Z or a Gen Alpha have to go in and ask somebody for a raise, and you have to have that conversation in person, they may not be as prepared or have the ability to do that, you know, and they may say, well, why can't I just send an email, or why can't it just be a text? And so having kind of that older generation that can help them understand the importance of still maintaining a personal relationship and how do you go in and how do you have those face-to-face conversations are going to be really useful. Also benefits from a knowledge transfer and retention standpoint. And so allowing our businesses to be aware of all of the strengths that each generation offers is going to make sure that as an organization, we're better prepared to meet our future leadership needs. You know, leadership is often still going to be based, at least in some part, on tenure within an organization or tenure within an industry. And so making sure that we have a way to transition historical knowledge internally is really important. But it also means that we have to focus more intentionally as an organization on how we build our internal talent pipeline, right? And then another one of the benefits is that it fosters unique relationships when you have all these different generations working in one place, because it is more like a family structure. And so, you know, there are opportunities for personal connections that people can have outside of their typical generation. And so, again, both from a workspace perspective, but also from a personal perspective, you know, what are we gaining from being able to have those personal connections with folks or generations that maybe we don't often have the opportunity to build those with. And of course, not just benefits, but there are challenges that come with having a multi-generational workforce. And so one of the biggest ones that I often hear about is communication, right? Differences in preferred communication style, interpretation of tone. So as I mentioned, I've got, you know, a Gen Zer at home. I've got a couple of Gen Alphas. My Gen Zer will text me from her bedroom when I am in the house, which, you know, drives me insane. But that's just what she's used to. You know, she sits in a room with her friends at an event or a party or a game, and they're all on their phones texting. And if I say to her, who are you texting? 9 times out of 10, the answer is, you know, the person who's seated 2 feet away from her. That's just kind of what they're used to. What I think is funny is, you know, my 2 Gen Alphas, texting takes too much time for them, right? They would rather just FaceTime me, ask me whatever it is they need to know, get an immediate answer, and then be done with it. And so we have to appreciate that within our workplace, when we, you know, send out internal communications, external communications, whether they're one-on-one, whether they're to the organization as a whole, that there are going to be differences in those people's preferred communication styles and how they may interpret our messaging based on the way that we've communicated it. I think another challenge is the negative stereotypes that are associated with some of the generational differences that we talked about, right? And so the first slide that I gave you before we went into the differences was around generational acceptance and making sure that we're not just stereotyping and just assuming that every stereotype is accurate or appropriate. So, you know, when you make these sweeping kind of generalizations, they're often more negative than they are positive stereotypes, right? And so when they're more negative, they can result in a toxic culture. They can, result in disparate treatment of employees or ageism, again, because somebody is perceived, because they're older, perceived to be reacting in one way, or perhaps because they're younger, reacting in one way. So, we want to make sure that we understand that and we're being proactive about addressing it. And then varying employee expectations. So there are going to be differences in what employees expect from us as their employer based on, again, their own lived experiences that relate to their, kind of generation. And that can often lead to frustration and disappointment because they may think that, they've got one way to get the job done and the employer is saying, nope, I want it done this way. Or how we offer to provide trainings to our employees, how we conduct performance evaluations, whether it's, the substantive components of an evaluation, whether it's how often we're conducting evaluations, the method that we're utilizing. And so, as an employer, we often will try to standardize employee procedures and processes because, number one, it lessens our administrative burden. But number two, it also often, from my perspective, can mitigate legal risk, right? If we're doing everything the same, there's less likelihood that somebody is going to be able to say that they were treated differently because of some, particular protected issue. But the flip side of that is when you're looking at it from a multi-generational perspective, it can create a toxic culture for people if they're feeling like their expectations are not being met by the employer. So how do we address those issues? The key is really being proactive. There we go. Being proactive in managing our generational workforces. And so that really goes across the entire life cycle of an employee. So when we're looking at things that are typically in the pre-hire process, ways that we can proactively manage our multi-generational workforce, we're looking at things like striving to eliminate age bias in your recruiting, right? Sometimes people will say, we have a young workforce. And that can be viewed by somebody who is either doing your recruiting internally or externally or involved in your interviewing process as, we don't want to hire anybody over a specific age. Now, again, that hasn't been said to somebody directly, but that may be the perception. Or we really want people who are hard workers and go-getters. And that could be viewed by somebody as saying, well, you know what? Millennials are kind of lazy. They don't really want to work hard. And so that's not who we're looking for. So it's important that you are finding ways to eliminate that age bias in your recruiting. And that starts by educating your hiring personnel about about age bias and about what are the specific things that you're looking for as an organization. And that they can't necessarily be found within a particular generation or not found within a particular generation. And then also expanding your recruiting channels to use as many different channels as possible, right? And so, you'll often hear people say, you do the same thing, you get the same results. And that's true in recruiting. If you're only going to, two different spots to focus your recruiting on, you're often going to be getting the same kinds of candidates. And so if you make an intentional step to expand where you're recruiting and how you're recruiting and what tools you're utilizing, you're going to likely expand the base of folks that are coming in for consideration. The next is looking at your job descriptions for what we call coded language that could be viewed as ageist. And so some examples of that is, job descriptions that talk about we're looking for, fresh talent, high energy, somebody who's a digital native, right? Those are often things that are indirectly tied to age. And so you want to make sure that you are replacing those kinds of things with more neutral terms that won't, on its face, kind of look to folks as though you're making age determinations. You also want to make sure that you reflect a mix of ages in your employer branding. So whether it's on your careers pages on your website, whether it's on employee profiles that maybe you highlight within your organization or externally, and the materials, the collateral materials that you use for your recruiting, there was a specific shift, an intentional shift, kind of over the last several years from a DEI perspective to make sure that, we were looking at race and sex and making sure that those were evenly displayed on, again, career pages, profiles, our collateral. But there hasn't been that same intention necessarily when it comes to age. And so looking kind of with that through that lens at your current materials and how you brand yourself as an employer is going to impact, how you're viewed as a multi-generational workforce. Easy things, which hopefully you all know in terms of don't ask for dates of birth or graduation dates on your applications, because obviously those directly correlate to age in most cases. Conduct periodic audits of your processes and your procedures with really a scan specifically for bias. If any of you are using any AI systems or systems that integrate AI when it comes to recruiting, you are often going to be required to do this. Certainly in New York, we've got those obligations at the state level, but also, the EEOC has said that one of the things that they look for when there are age-related or other related claims is whether, as an employer, you've audited your own systems periodically to make sure that there isn't any implicit bias in the system. And then looking at whether your employee value proposition appeals to a broad spectrum of generations. So when somebody says to you, why should I work for your company? Or, we tell people this is why, you want to work for us. Looking at what sort of that elevator speech is or what that canned answer is that we give to people to make sure that what we're telling them about the value proposition of us as an employer and what we can provide to you as an employee is something that's going to appeal across generations. When we look at during employment, right? We've hired somebody now. What are ways that we can be proactive about managing the multi-generational workforce? The one we talked about is one of the biggest challenges, right? Catering to different communication styles. And so while we want consistency in company-wide communications and maybe certain standards that are related to our brand voice, and those things are okay, we often should be looking for ways to facilitate different communication styles on smaller scales. So, again, whether you've got a manager who, sends everything out by email or, notifies all of their employees in one particular way, is there opportunities where they could be changing that up a little bit, right? Maybe we send it out via email and text. Or, if we're doing a training, maybe instead of giving everybody, a packet of materials or, here's a printout of a slide deck, maybe there's some video communication that we can incorporate or some face-to-face training, different giving opportunities to facilitate different communication styles that employees of different generations may appreciate. So it doesn't always have to be one way, and we don't always have to change it up, right? But if we're showing that we take opportunities to be able to tailor the way that we communicate with our employees, particularly internally, we're building some of that acceptance, and we're building some comfortability for those employees across different generations within our workplace. The next is making sure that we make our expectations clear. So all employees, no matter what generation they are in, right, they want to be clear on what are the business goals of the organization and what is their specific role in getting there. And so we want to make sure that as leaders, we're establishing clear channels of communication to deliver those expectations on an ongoing basis. And again, how you deliver them and how often you deliver them may vary depending on generation, because again, stereotypically your Gen Zers, your millennials are going to want more consistent, more frequent feedback. And so making sure that if there are opportunities to clarify expectations or to let people know of changes, again, maybe with their role or how it impacts the organization or whether there's changes to business goals, that we're looking at the ability to tailor those to the different generations that we're dealing with. We also want to encourage feedback from employees across the generations. And so whether that's surveys that we send out, whether it's one-on-ones that we conduct, whether they're 1 or 2 question, just pulse surveys, again, utilizing different methods is going to ensure that we're getting the most feedback across the most generations. And again, the more feedback we have, the better, right? The more information we have, the better positioned we're going to be to ensure that the decisions we make are taking into account the most information. And then it's about accommodating diverse working styles, right? And so if we're an organization that can adjust to our employees' needs, we're going to be more likely to attract and retain the best available talent pool. And right now, I think probably most of you would agree, right? Retention is a significant issue. And so making sure that we can put ourselves in a position to best retain our best employees is always going to make us, a better, more successful employer. Also talking about learning opportunities. Don't limit upskilling or reskilling to younger workers. That's, I think, a mistake that a lot of organizations make when they look at, well, what are some opportunities for people to gain new skills, or what are some opportunities to kind of strengthen the existing skill set that you have? And they look at or focus primarily on, here's kind of our younger generation of workers, and let's direct most of those opportunities to them. We want to make sure that we're providing a wide array of knowledge and building opportunities across our organizations. We also want to directly address those stereotypes, right? So the stereotypes that we talked about that could create a negative culture because they have negative connotations, we want to take deliberate actions in whatever way we can to dispel those biases, to dispel those stereotypes based on age. And one of the ways that we can do that is by conducting trainings, right, to confront age-based stereotypes, and to look at and kind of put that right out there for people as something that we're talking about within our organization, because we understand that it's important. We want to have a positive multi-generational workforce culture. And so as an employer, we're directly addressing those things. And then also looking at a focus on individual attributes, right? What are the unique mix of skills and experience that each individual team member is going to bring to the table, rather than just focusing on what somebody's title is or what their seniority is? Can you approach development conversations, and are you approaching development conversations in a positive light? So instead of having a conversation with somebody to say, you need to get better at X, which is, a skill set that maybe that person doesn't inherently have, and maybe it is generationally based, looking at it and saying, you know what, how can we leverage you and the particular skill set and the things that you do bring to the table? How can we leverage that, as opposed to just necessarily focusing on kind of what the negative aspects are, right? And then looking at, what does that individual person need for us to help them become successful within our organization. The next component is mentoring, right? So Pricewaterhouse did a survey that showed that 91% of workers who have a mentor are satisfied with their jobs. And the retention rates for mentees, people who have a mentor, are typically 50% higher than those who are not mentored, right? So mentoring is a really important opportunity that not a lot of organizations are taking advantage of. And it's a way to increase your retention and some of those other benefits in terms of knowledge transfer and development of personal relationships and loyalty to an organization, ways to enhance all of those things. And so how do you do that, right? Building a mentoring program, there's no single way that you have to do it or necessarily, kind of a cookie cutter approach. But there are in general some things that I think are useful and can help you build a more successful mentoring program than others. So the first is use data, right? Create a questionnaire that gathers information on employee skills, on their preferred communication styles, what are their overall career goals, and then use that information to match who the best mentors and mentees would be, as opposed to just kind of a concept of like, well, we just pulled that out of a hat, or like, you're next in line for a mentee, and so like, we're going to give you whoever's next up. Those types of systems don't necessarily work. When I've told the story to folks before, and maybe on one of these webinars, but when I first started as a lawyer, I came in, and at the firm at the time, they had a very kind of rigid mentoring program. And so it was like, you came in, we've picked this person, we're putting the two of you together. Congratulations, you're now a mentor and a mentee, and best of luck. And so the mentor that I was assigned was another woman, and probably within the first 2 days, maybe, she came in to introduce herself and to talk to me and to say, congratulations, I'm your mentor. And one of the first things she said to me is, you're a new lawyer, you really don't know much about anything, and so it's really better to just be seen and not heard. And, as somebody who was like so excited to be a lawyer and coming out of law school, I was like so deflated that, I thought, oh my God, like, what am I doing? And so, suffice it to say, our mentor-mentee relationship did not last very long. And I actually at the time had given some feedback to somebody else who had kind of become an informal mentor to me, to say, hey, like, our current system here is not great. Like, here has been my experience. And if anybody else has had a similar experience, like, this isn't good for anybody. We should find a way to fix this mentoring program. But, again, that was an example of just using sort of the next up approach, as opposed to actually trying to be proactive and find out how we can tailor mentors and mentees together, right? And then establish criteria for your mentorship program. Create a core set of responsibilities for both the mentors as well as the mentees. Encourage regular check-ins and to say, hey, as a mentorship program, we want you to be meeting regularly or checking in regularly, but at a minimum, we expect it to be, once every 2 weeks or once a month, or whatever the case may be, so that everybody understands what their obligations are, and you're kind of all working within some sort of established criteria. And then really integrating that mentorship aspect into your culture organizationally. So promoting it during recruitment kind of as one of, the things that you offer, both for, cross-generationally. So you're getting some of the benefits of mentorship and reverse mentorship. And that's something that, potentially could align with workers regardless of which generation they're in. And then making sure that all of the people who are participating in your mentorship program have whatever tools they need to be successful, and that we're getting feedback from them on a regular basis about how the mentorship program is working, how their individual mentoring relationship is, and ways that we can continue to improve those kinds of programs. One of the other things that we talk about in terms of ways to be proactive about how you manage your multi-generational workforce is on the benefit side, right? So Price Waterhouse in another survey that they did had data that predicted that nearly a quarter of all employees would leave their roles in 2024 due to workplace dissatisfaction. And 66% of employees who were surveyed said that they believe that benefits that are available to them hold equal or more importance than just their salary compensation figure. And again, 75% of those say that they are more likely to stay with a company due to the benefits that are being offered. So those are really, really high numbers when we're looking at what are the keys to not only recruitment, but retention of employees. And so benefits is clearly right up there in the top 1 or 2 or 3 things that we need to be thinking about as an organization to improve our, again, not only our recruiting, but our retention. And so we want to personalize the benefits to our business, right? Incorporate what our unique needs are and how those impact our emerging talent, our working parents, our more mature staff, kind of different diverse groups. Find out what they want through regular feedback loops. There may be, I was just talking to a client not too long ago that said, well, we offer, this benefit to somebody who, is having their first child. We offer this additional leave. We offer kind of some of this ramp up and ramp down time. And they said, it's been really well received by, those employees who are taking advantage of the benefits. They said, but, we're hearing some feedback from some of our, kind of more long tenured employees who are saying, hey, I also have challenges now on the other side where I may not be caring for a child at home, et cetera, but I've got aging parents that I'm dealing with. And so, I could use some time or some resources or some support, to deal with those issues. And so making sure that we're looking at, kind of what are our unique needs based on the makeup of our workforce, where we want that diversity to be, and finding out from all of those employees across the generations, what is it that they want, right, from a benefits perspective. And then making sure that we're doing a really good job of communicating the benefits that we do offer. So showcase what our benefit offerings are consistently. I can't tell you the number of times that I will talk to an employer who will say, well, an employee came to me and they're complaining about this, or they want a raise, but, don't they know that we contribute X to their retirement? And, we pay this percentage of the health insurance benefits. And I'll say to them, okay, does the employee know that? Have you had that conversation? And I think a lot of times as an employer, we assume that our employees just know that, or like they've read the plan description, or they've read the handbook. And oftentimes we take for granted that our employees have that information, and they don't. So we want to make sure that we're showcasing it on a consistent basis, that we're aligning it with our internal communication strategies, and that we're echoing those at all levels of the organization, right? So from the top down, we want to make sure that we are communicating all of the benefits that we offer. And then change, right? Look at your benefits on a regular basis. Make sure that they reflect, what the current market is, what the changing needs are of your organization, and conduct kind of regular market research and benchmark against that, so that if employees come and say, I'd like this, or I'd like that, or, my cousin's company does this, or my friend's company does that, we have good data to be able to say, we've looked at that, and, that's really out of market, or, what, we are considering that, and that does appear to be kind of in market with what, our offerings might be able to be. And then, if you want to take it a step further to kind of create a benefits matrix, It's really nothing more than just kind of a feedback framework to understand what the needs of your workforce are. So what are the things that people have told you and communicated to you via a survey or employee ideas that have come to you? What's the market research that you've done? Create that framework and then prioritize what your strategic objectives are as an organization from a benefits perspective, right? Employee well-being, who's our generational audience? From an industry competitive standpoint, what are our other competitors offering? What are the things that we need to do? How are we doing with retention? Is that something we need to be concerned about? And we should be focusing more on that. And then tailor your individual benefits package according to those objectives, right? Because what you offer is going to be different and should be different than what, the company next door offers. And then also as part of that, you want to identify what are the metrics by which you're going to define success for the return on investment, both short-term and long-term for your benefits package, right? Because at the end of the day, we could offer 1 million benefits, and if people aren't taking advantage of them, or we're just kind of running money out the door for benefits that people aren't using, that's not helpful to us from a bottom line standpoint, certainly not going to be helpful to us from an organizational standpoint or from a retention standpoint. And so making sure that we can identify what are those metrics and continually then evaluate and update that matrix as your needs and goals evolve as an organization, as the scope of your generational workplace and workforce evolves. What are those changes? And don't be afraid to, say, what, we've offered this benefit and really doesn't seem like people are taking advantage of it. So we're gonna change it to something else. So the last piece then is just talking about some ideas of what are things that we can do to build a multi-generational culture that's positive. And so the first is, if your goal is to improve communication, here's a sample exercise that you might want to think about how you can tailor to your organization. But something as simple as coming up with an idea that, each of your employees has to pitch to a coworker, and you give them each 5 or 10 minutes to jot down, kind of notes about what they would pitch and how they would pitch that concept. And then pair them up with a colleague of a different generational background and have them kind of go through that exercise of kind of pitching the concepts, but then taking it a step further once they've done that, to have them, discuss or facilitate a discussion as a group about how they could have adapted their pitches to make them more persuasive to the other person of a different generation, whether that's thinking things and being intentional about what language they selected or kind of the tone of the presentation or their attitude, how they approached it. That will often give some good ideas of ways that they can improve communication going forward. The next is kind of, if your goal is to create an exercise that arrives at a consensus of shared values organizationally, having each team member take a few minutes to think about what are their top 3 workplace values. And then once they've done that, dividing them into groups of 3 to 5 people, kind of again, varying different generations, and having each of them go around and share what they value the most. And then that will help everyone have kind of a clearer picture of where are their values overlapping with their colleagues and where do they differ. And that can help you organizationally to say, in this group, everyone put this value in the top 3. And so as an organization, we know that that's important across the board. And then, where are the ones that differ? And the last is, if your goal of fostering a better understanding of generational differences, and we talked about kind of some of the ways you can train that, having employees write down what they believe to be 2 of their own individual strengths as well as their own weaknesses. And then again, break them into the same kind of teams of varying generations and have them discuss what they came up with. And that will not only help kind of promote self-awareness, but it will also give employees insight into their own colleagues and how they approach their own strengths, their own weaknesses, and hopefully will help to improve how they interact with each other in the workplace. So that is our hour. I hope everybody enjoyed the presentation. If you want a copy of it, of the materials afterwards to go through any of the exercises or any of the information, feel free to reach out. Happy to provide it to you. Our next seminar will be in June. If I have it in front of me, let's see. Passing the Advil, avoiding PTO and leave headaches. And so those materials will be coming out with the May newsletter, and then I'll send a separate webinar invite for that as well. So thanks everybody for joining, and hopefully I will see you next month. Take care.